Imagine fighting a war for nearly 30 years after it had already ended. It sounds impossible, but that's exactly what happened to one Japanese soldier during World War II. While the rest of the world was rebuilding cities, starting families, watching television, and even preparing to send humans into space, one man was still hiding in the jungle, convinced that the war was not over. The story begins in 1944 during the final years of World War II. A young Japanese intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines. Before he left, his commander gave him a very specific order. He was told never to surrender, never to take his own life, and never to stop fighting until his commanding officer personally returned to relieve him of duty. To most soldiers, those might have sounded like ordinary military orders. To Onoda, they became a lifelong mission. A year later, in 1945, World War II officially ended. Japan surrendered, celebrations erupted across the globe, and millions of soldiers began returning home. For most people, the war was finally over. But not for Onoda. When aircraft dropped leaflets over the island announcing that Japan had surrendered, he immediately assumed they were fake. From his perspective, it made perfect sense. Why would an enemy tell the truth during a war? Surely it was a trick designed to lure Japanese soldiers out of hiding. Then newspapers appeared showing photographs of peace, celebrations, and reports that the fighting had ended. Onoda dismissed them as propaganda. Villagers tried to explain that the war was over. He assumed they were lying. Search parties called out his name and begged him to come home. He believed they were enemy agents attempting to deceive him. Every piece of evidence that should have convinced him only strengthened his belief that the war was still being fought. As the years passed, Onoda and a small group of fellow soldiers continued living deep in the jungle. They built shelters, gathered food, repaired their equipment, and occasionally carried out raids because they genuinely believed they were still fighting for Japan. To them, every search operation proved that the enemy was still active. Every attempt to contact them became further evidence that they were important targets. The world outside changed dramatically while they remained frozen in time. The war ended, nations recovered, new governments were formed, the Cold War began, television became common, humans invented computers, people walked on the moon. Yet Onoda remained hidden in the jungle, wearing the same uniform, carrying the same rifle, and waiting for orders that would never come. Eventually, the group became smaller. Some soldiers surrendered, others died. Decades passed, and Onoda found himself completely alone. Still, he refused to give up. By the early 1970s, most people assumed he was dead. His family had long accepted that they would probably never see him again. Yet he was still out there, surviving in the wilderness and preparing for a war that had ended nearly 30 years earlier. Then, in 1974, something extraordinary happened. A young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki decided he wanted to find the missing soldier. Unlike the military, police, and government teams that had searched for years, Suzuki simply believed he could locate him himself. Against all odds, he succeeded. After searching through the jungle, Suzuki eventually came face to face with Onoda. The two men spoke, and Suzuki tried to explain that Japan had surrendered decades earlier, but Onoda refused to believe him. He had heard similar stories before and considered them enemy tricks. Finally, Suzuki asked a simple question. "What would convince you?" Onoda's answer was immediate. "My commanding officer." Only the man who had originally given him his orders could officially release him from duty. Remarkably, Japanese authorities managed to track down that commander. By then, he was an elderly man living a completely ordinary life. Nearly 30 years had passed since he had last seen Onoda. Soon he traveled to the island and met the soldier once again. Standing in the jungle, the former commander formally informed Onoda that World War II had ended and that his mission was complete. He was relieved of duty and ordered to return home. For a long moment, Onoda stood silently. Then he slowly lowered his rifle, the rifle he had carried for decades. The war he had spent nearly 30 years fighting was finally over. When he returned to Japan, he entered a world he barely recognized. The country had transformed beyond imagination. Modern buildings filled the cities. Technology was everywhere. Entire generations had grown up during the time he spent hidden in the jungle. Imagine leaving home in one era and returning almost 30 years later to find a completely different world. That is exactly what happened. And that is the incredible true story of Hiroo Onoda, the soldier who continued fighting World War II long after the rest of the world had moved on. If the story had not been recorded by history itself, most people would never believe it actually happened.